So, for this video, I want to talk a little bit about social psychology, specifically um, the distinction between social psychology as done in um, sociology and psychology, but also the differences between social psychology and sociology, um, and the differences between social psychology and psychology. So let's start there. Let's talk a little bit about the differences between social psychology and psychology. There are two major differences between these two. The first is a rejection of behaviorism. The social psychological perspective rejects the idea that the mind is kind of a reactive and unchanging structure, that we aren't simply responding to external stimuli in conditioned ways. And what that means, of course, is kind of classic Pavlovian behaviorism, in which we come to associate particular kinds of outcomes with particular kinds of environmental conditions, right? We are trained, if you will, to respond to something that happens in the world around us in a sort of pre-established fashion. It kind of stems back to the work that kind of got that whole ball rolling, which was when Pavlov's assistants would bring food for the dogs in his lab. The dogs had become accustomed to hearing the approaching footsteps of the assistants and the arrival of food, and the presence of food would produce would produce salivation. After a period of time, Pavlov observed that when the dogs heard the approaching footsteps, they would begin to salivate, even if food was not actually being delivered. And that's where we kind of start with a kind of classic behaviorism model that was at the core of psychology back in the 1800s. And social psychology is very explicitly kind of a rejection of that. Another distinction between social psychology and psychology is that social psychology rejects a focus on the individual, right? The interest of a social psychologist lies not in understanding the mind, at least the mind in a kind of disconnected way, right? The mind is a phenomena in and of itself. Social psychology rejects the idea that the mind is an inner psychic world somehow separate from society, right? And the idea that it's possible to understand the mind independently of understanding the context in which it operates, right? So that's another feature of social psychology that separates or distinguishes it from psychology. The difference between social psychology and sociology is essentially just that social psychology emphasizes mind and process and agency, and sociology tends to emphasize things like history and institutions and kind of structural features of society. Social psychologists will focus a little bit on um, um, the impact of social structure, say, for example, on phenomena like constraint and conformity, although they tend to be less deterministic than sociologists tend to be when it comes to understanding and sort of tracking the impact of those things. Now, as I mentioned, there's a distinction between social psychology as done by psychologists, what we would call psychological social psychology, or PSP for short, which is distinct from sociological social psychology, or what we would call SSP, also just because sociological social psychology is a great big mouthful. These are two variations on social psychology that, as you'll note in the chapter, kind of diverge relatively early, right? So in the 1800s, as social psychology is becoming a distinct field, there are psychologists who kind of run in one direction with that discipline, focusing a lot on laboratory and experimental work. And there are sociologists who go in a very different direction, focusing on an immersive study and an examination of people in the social environments in which they operate, right? And so those diverging perspectives have led to a really significant gap between the two different kinds of social psychology. In the process of working on the OER for this course, part of what inspired me to do that is the lack of a textbook in sociological social psychology that's relatively accessible and easy to understand for undergraduate students. When I was looking at psychological social psychology textbooks, I would often find no mention of the significant figures in sociological social psychology. When I would look at social psychology textbooks kind of published in the field of sociology or by sociological social psychologists, I would find, in addition to a recognition of the contributions of sociological social psychologists, there would also be an acknowledgement of the work of psychological social psychologists, people like Piaget and Erikson and guys like that. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that these two fields are so distinct in the 21st century, and I think it's really kind of unfortunate that there's not more synthesis, if you will. But again, very different methodological approaches, very different underlying assumptions at play there. So it isn't maybe it isn't as surprising as it might seem. The two major differences can kind of be summed up as follows. For psychological social psychology, we would say that represents, in essence, the systematic study of how thoughts and feelings and behaviors are influenced by other people, right? What is the impact of other people on us? Right? That's not the only focus, and it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that is kind of at the core of psychological social psychology. Sociological social psychology, SSP, is the systematic study of the nature and causes of human behavior. Right, so not the influence of society on the individual, but rather where individual behavior originates and what are the consequences of it for organizing society in the way that it's organized. And the major trends in sociological social psychology are sort of bound up in the emergence of this particular kind of social psychology called symbolic interactionism. There are other kinds of social psychology within sociology, so exchange theory, for example, or dramaturgical analysis, right? So there are some other elements, and those we'll kind of talk about a little bit later in the semester. But the original sort of development was this field called symbolic interaction, which begins in the early 1900s with some sociologists at the University of Chicago. Cooley, Charles Cooley, is also kind of a contributing theorist, although because he's at a different school, and the early researchers and the early theorists in sociological social psychology mostly kind of come out of Chicago, Cooley doesn't get as much attention as somebody like, say, for example, George Herbert Mead. Um, George Herbert Mead um, um, develops in the early 1900s, develops something that he kind of thinks of as a kind of social behaviorism. So classical behavioral psychology says stimulus response. And Mead comes along and says, actually, I think it's stimulus interpretation response. He's really, really interested in the fact that human behavior isn't simply a response to external stimuli, but rather a considered response to external stimuli. We think about what we are going to do. We think about how what we will do has an impact on other people. We think about the meanings of the experiences we're having, but also the consequences of the actions that we're going to engage in. And that kind of gives him this sort of middle space to develop that had been kind of overlooked by Pavlov and by other kind of classical behaviorists. So Mead's doing all of this at the University of Chicago, and he's having a profound influence on a number of his students, notably this guy named Bloomer. Bloomer writes a book in 1937 in which he kind of formalizes the ideas and the theories that were put out by Mead. He writes this book called Symbolic Interactionism in 1937. Mead did not call what he was doing symbolic interactionism. That's a term that gets applied to it later. So Bloomer writes this book in which he talks about the methodological approaches, some of the underlying assumptions, the importance of Mead's work to sort of the shape and dimensions of that discipline. Mead actually never published anything. It was his one very notable book that most people who study this stuff make note of is a book called Mind, Self, and Society. But Mind, Self, and Society is in fact a collection of his lectures that were compiled after his death by his students, but they published the book in Mead's name. And so we have a kind of a primary source from Mead, but it wasn't ever actually written up by Mead as a book. That was actually something that his students did. So Mead, and then later on, as I say, Bloomer, along with people like Robert Park and William Thomas and Everett Hughes, form this sort of intellectual community that we call the Chicago School, right? So we have these kind of groups of sociologists and social psychologists kind of loosely kind of organized around a set of methodological approaches and underlying theoretical assumptions and some other shared characteristics. And that it's not really big enough to be called a paradigm, but that particular community of scholars and sort of like-minded people becomes what we call in sociology the Chicago School. And then their students, right? This is how it kind of works, right? That these university professors work with graduate students who then go on to become university professors of their own with their own students, and kind of a genealogical or a family tree, if you will, but one of academics and scholars. So people like Howard Becker and Irving Goffman, Helen Lapata, Levi Strauss, these guys, and we'll come across their theories at various points in the semester, but these people form what we ultimately kind of come to call the second Chicago School, which is the children and the grandchildren, the scholarly children and grandchildren of people like Mead and Bloomer. And as I said, the character and the flavor of this particular school, of the Chicago School, is kind of distinguished by its focus and by its methodology. So the assumptions and the premises, which I'll talk about in a subsequent video, but also the use, the heavy reliance on something we call ethnographic methodology, which is kind of something that gets borrowed from anthropology, and it's a methodology in which the researcher kind of immerses themselves in the in the environments that they're studying. Kind of observation and participant observation become really, really common research methodologies and research designs in this particular discipline. In my own work, right, I spend when I do research on people who are homeless, I spend time just hanging out in places like Chicago or in places like London with homeless people, talking to them, observing them, sort of getting a sense of the fullness of their daily round, right? The things that characterize their day-to-day lives, which is very different than, giving them a survey and asking them a series of questions, or relying on secondary data like policies and making some inferences about what impact those policies might have on people's behaviors. So an immersive field experience, which we call ethnography, kind of becomes the core of doing these kinds of social psychological analyses kind of inside the Chicago school, which produces a kind of, I'd call it a reaction. There are, by the 1930s and the 1940s, a lot of social psychologists, a lot of symbolic interactionists who are interested in sort of distinguishing themselves from people like Mead and the people who kind of influenced Mead, like Dewey and Paris and some of these others. They want to create a social psychology, a symbolic interaction that's grounded in experiment. They want to kind of be more like the approach that psychology is taking to all of this. So these would be people like Manfred Kuhn and Thomas Zerker. And again, we'll talk about all of these guys over the course of the semester. But Kuhn and Zerker, and people who are kind of working in that tradition, a more quantitative rather than qualitative based set of methodologies, they're working at places like Iowa and Indiana. So we call those people the Iowa or Indiana School, or sometimes the Iowa/Indiana School. Because their emphasis is on self-concept, which is something we're going to talk about later in the semester, and their focus on the self-concept as a kind of structure, as a thing that gets built up, through a process of socialization. They are also sometimes called structural interactionists because they are symbolic interactionists, but they're interested in looking at the self as a kind of social structure. And again, we will dive into all of that in much greater detail. But for now, I want you guys to recognize that that social psychology is distinct from psychology, and it's distinct from sociology, right? It's this sort of its own animal. It draws very heavily on a lot of work from both of those traditions, but there's a lot of rejection of the underlying assumptions of both psychology and sociology, as well as the focus of both psychology and sociology. And even within social psychology, there's wide variation and sometimes outright disagreement. So you've got the psychological social psychology is very distinct from the sociological social psychology, and even within sociological social psychology, there are a wide variety of camps. So you've got symbolic interaction, which itself is kind of divided between the Chicago School and the Iowa-Indiana School. You've got dramaturgical analysis, which is going to be the work of people like Irving Goffman, exchange theory, and some of these others. Phenomenology, which we probably won't talk about because, again, this is just an undergraduate introductory course, but it is a really rich field, and it has a lot of variability within it, and a lot of really interesting theory. And I think all of these different schools and all of these different traditions have created a lot of really, really useful stuff, some of which, you can embrace or in their entirety, or you can kind of treat it a little bit like a cafeteria sometimes and pick and choose the kind of concepts that will allow you to generate the understandings of the social world that you're interested in understanding. So in my next video, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of the underlying assumptions of symbolic interaction, because that will be the part of social psychology that we probably spend the greatest amount of time on in this class. So I want to make sure you guys have a clear sort of sense of what is involved in that. But at least at this point, you have a little bit of a sense of the history of the discipline. All right, until next time.